On the day of his wedding to Julian Vance, a young Omega found Julian's intended, Asher Drake, in the antechamber of the grand ballroom. Tears traced paths down his flushed cheeks as he pleaded for Asher to be merciful. He explained that he could be the secret, the shadow, while Asher was the wife. He would be the hotel, Asher the home. He asked for no title, only to remain near the alpha he adored. Asher wiped a tear from the boy's cheek with his thumb, his voice a low murmur against the Omega's ear. He confided that Julian kept more than a dozen lovers and asked if the boy might consider him instead. He was also an alpha, but he was strictly monogamous. The Omega's eyes, red-rimmed and glistening, widened. He whispered that it wasn't Julian's fault, that he shouldn't have come, he just needed one last look. Julian's voice cut through the air, sharp as ice. He looked at Asher, his gaze frigid, and stated that since he had already agreed to the marriage, there was no need for Asher to torment Tommy. Asher insisted he had no intention of tormenting anyone. He moved with a liquid grace, slipping a business card infused with his agave-scented pheromones into the Omega's jacket pocket. Leaning in, he murmured again. He told Tommy that Julian had a dozen others just like him, but that he, Asher, had no one and was a one-man man. The implications hung in the air, causing the Omega to freeze, tears held captive on his lashes. Julian's face darkened. He warned Asher that the boy was his. Fine. Asher raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, a sly smile playing on his lips as he backed away. He told Julian that his generosity was overwhelming, so he supposed he had no choice but to accept. Julian was confused, asking what he meant. Asher's smile widened into a grin, revealing a flash of white teeth. $20 million. Only then did Julian remember, a flicker of irritation crossing his handsome features. He had a cherished memory, a white moonlight named Thomas who had passed away. In his grief, he had collected over a dozen surrogates. Asher Drake, on the other hand, was an award-winning actor, an alpha with a penchant for collecting beautiful people. Changing partners every few weeks, be they Omegas or Betas, Ice Queens or Boys Next Door. In the elite circles of Manhattan, they were infamous, two apex predators and bitter rivals who never crossed paths, until a marriage contract fell from the sky. Julian's grandmother, Eleanor Vance, had been diagnosed with a rare blood disorder, giving her a year and a half at most. In a baffling turn, her will stipulated that her $100 billion fortune would go to Julian and Asher, on the condition that they marry and produce an heir. An absurd proposition for two alphas. But the moment the news broke, Asher's father pulled him from a party with his entourage and informed him that after 25 years of indulgence, it was time to contribute to the family legacy. Asher's wild lifestyle had only been tolerated because of his family's power. His father made it clear, if Asher refused, he would be cut off. His projects were canceled, roles recast, endorsements dropped. His agent was sent on a 2-year paid vacation to Europe. His assistant tearfully accepted a $2 million severance package, wishing him luck with having twins in 3 years. He tried to drown his sorrows at a downtown speakeasy, but when the bill came, his cards were declined. His fiery Omega friend had to cover the tab. Head bowed, Asher finally submitted to his father's will and met with Julian Vance. Julian's situation was no better. His corporation was teetering on the edge of a hostile takeover. Bankruptcy would mean he couldn't even afford to keep his coterie of pretty boys. He sat across from Asher in a sterile Soho coffee shop, his face a thunderous mask. Asher attempted a smile, trying to smooth the waters, but Julian cut him off. He laid out the terms. A sham marriage, a divorce as soon as the inheritance was secured, and complete non-interference in each other's lives. He offered Asher $5 billion. Asher countered that without him, the money would all go to charity. He demanded a 70-30 split. Julian agreed. The introduction to Eleanor Vance was a strange affair. The old woman was utterly charmed by Asher, holding his hand, patting his backside with an appreciative thump that made his brow twitch. Julian watched with unconcealed amusement. When Eleanor asked Asher's opinion on the marriage, he feigned great enthusiasm. The matriarch then delicately inquired which of them planned to carry the child. In unison, they both pointed at the other and said his name. They paused, exchanging a look. Julian was classically handsome, with sharp brows, a straight nose and thin lips, a face built for power and devoid of warmth. Asher was breathtaking, with almond-shaped eyes that sparkled with mischief and a beauty mark just below his lip that seemed to invite chaos. Again, they spoke as one, declaring the other would be the one to carry the child. Eleanor clapped her hands, delighted by their supposed synchronicity. She then gently advised them to clean up their pasts and focus on their marriage, joking that whoever couldn't rein in their hedonistic tendencies would either carry the child or pay the other a $20 million penalty. And so, the $20 million had come into play. The little Omega, Tommy, didn't appear again during the wedding, but Julian was far from having a clean break. He had cultivated a persona of a devoted lover with each of his stand-ins, leaving them all with a glimmer of hope. After the ceremony, Asher demanded his $20 million. Julian, looking displeased, wrote a check he knew would bounce, his company's assets being frozen. Asher refused it, his gaze turning suggestive. He offered an alternative. Julian, exasperated, made a call. Tommy was summoned. Julian asked the boy what he thought of Asher. Tommy glanced at Asher, his reply a shy, affirmative whisper. Julian nodded, telling Asher they were even now. Tommy was his. The sheer audacity of the man was breathtaking. Asher lowered his eyes, a dangerous thought forming. This wasn't his fault. Julian's plan to use Tommy to nullify the debt failed spectacularly. Word of the incident reached Eleanor, who descended upon their new penthouse to find Tommy about to join them in a threesome. Her fury was magnificent. She beat the boy out of the apartment with her cane and forced Julian to wire Asher the $20 million on the spot. Asher accepted with a cheerful grin as Julian seethed, his face crimson. Eleanor turned on her grandson, berating him for his recklessness. She reminded him that once married, he was expected to be settled. Shoving people into his husband's hands was not the way. She made it clear that she would only acknowledge an airborne from the two of them. After she left, Julian shot Asher a venomous look and turned to leave. Asher asked where he was going. Julian reminded him their marriage was purely for the inheritance. He had agreed to be celibate during their union, and Asher shouldn't expect anything more. With that, he stalked out of their marital home, leaving Asher to spend their wedding night alone. It was for the best. Asher pulled out his phone, added Tommy's contact information, and introduced himself. He sent a comforting message along with a $3 million wire transfer, suggesting the boy buy himself something nice. Tommy responded with a flurry of grateful puppy emojis. Humiliated by his grandmother, Julian sought to regain control at the first post-wedding family dinner. He didn't show. Eleanor dispatched Asher to retrieve him. A friend of Julian's answered his phone, slurring that Julian was drinking and asking who was calling. In the background, Julian's voice could be heard, boasting that marriage wouldn't stop him from having fun. Asher cheerfully told the friend he was coming on Eleanor's orders, got the address for the exclusive club, and called for a driver. This was classic Julian. The private room would be filled with his sycophantic friends, and Julian would have some new boy toy draped over him. Another $20 million was practically in his pocket. Asher pushed open the door to the VIP lounge. The air was thick with smoke and expensive cologne. A crowd of wealthy, blurred faces surrounded Julian, who sat enthroned with the same boy from the wedding, Tommy, nestled in his lap. Asher sighed internally. Someone asked who he was. One of Julian's friends, the one from the phone, recognized him and decided to stir the pot, loudly welcoming the missus. He assured Asher that they were watching Julian and he hadn't done anything wrong. Asher smiled and nodded. Just then, Julian tightened his arm around Tommy's waist, pulling him closer and announcing to the room that his spouse had arrived. The atmosphere turned instantly awkward. Julian was clearly trying to provoke him, certain he couldn't be extorted this time. To his surprise, Tommy shot up, his face lighting up as he called out to Asher, inviting him to sit next to him. Julian's expression soured. The 3 million had worked its magic. Asher politely declined, shaking his head with a smile before turning his attention to Julian. He stated that Eleanor wanted him home for dinner. Julian pulled Tommy back into his lap, retorting that he was busy. He explained it was a farewell party for Tommy, who was about to study abroad, and asked if Asher was really going to be so graceless as to make a scene. Tommy stood up again, tugging at Julian's arm, insisting the party was over and he should go home. Julian glared at the Omega, but Asher just laughed. It was all too entertaining. Asher announced that Tommy was his friend too, and he would explain everything to Eleanor. He then sat down on Tommy's other side, declaring he would join them in seeing him off. Tommy was now seated between the two alphas, blushing with pleasure at being the center of attention. The rest of the room watched in bewildered silence as Asher and Tommy chatted amiably, their conversation sparkling with wit and charm. Julian, meanwhile, sat beside them like a thundercloud, downing drink after drink. He had forgotten that Asher was an alpha too, and a master player at that. Asher knew precisely where to strike. He had already done his research. Tommy's father was a gambling addict with massive debts to loan sharks. Julian had kept Tommy for a year, paying his tuition and protecting him, but never offering to clear the family debt. It wasn't about the money. It was about leverage, a way to keep Tommy as a replacement. Tommy hadn't realized it until Julian tried to use him to pay off Asher. That's when he understood. Asher's $3 million was more than just a gift. It was an escape route. It was enough to get his family away from their troubles and fund his education abroad, allowing him to build a real future. Tommy's allegiance had shifted completely. Julian, growing bitter as he watched Tommy laugh with Asher, seemed to retreat into memory, his eyes glazing over as if thinking of his lost love. That perfect memory would never have been swayed by such a small kindness. The party dissolved into awkwardness, and the guests quickly made their excuses and left. With Julian thoroughly drunk, Tommy helped Asher get him into the car before bidding them a sincere farewell and thank you. Back at the penthouse, Asher explained the situation to Eleanor before hauling Julian into the bedroom. The man was a mess, reeking of alcohol, his hair disheveled, his shirt unbuttoned as he collapsed onto the bed. Moonlight streamed through the window, painting his face a ghostly white. Asher studied the shadows his lashes cast, the restless flutter of his eyelids, the proud line of his nose, and the thin, tightly pressed lips. He was brutally handsome and just as merciless. Asher sat on the edge of the bed, his gaze drifting to the solitary moon in the dark sky. A rustle of sheets broke the silence. Julian sat up, his eyes burning with a strange light, somewhere between lucidity and a drunken haze. He snarled that Asher must be pleased with himself. Then he lunged, pushing Asher down onto the mattress. One hand cradled the back of Asher's head as his breath came in ragged bursts. He kissed him, a desperate, trembling press of lips, before forcing Asher's mouth open. The passion was almost comical. Asher let him, curious to see how long it would take for him to realize his mistake. "Tommy," Julian mumbled against his lips. That was the last straw. Asher shoved him off, twisted his arm, and used Julian's own silk tie to bind his hands to the headboard. Julian stared up at him, eyes wide and wet with confusion. Asher had wanted to do this for a long time. He licked his lips, his eyes fixed on the firm stomach revealed by Julian's open shirt. His fingers traced a path up, then slowly, deliberately down. Julian had asked for this. He took Julian that night over and over again. The next morning, Julian looked ready to kill him. Asher merely had to graze his waist for him to cry out in pain. Asher calmly reminded him that their agreement never specified who would do the impregnating. He reasoned that it wasn't his fault Julian couldn't top him. It was a matter of skill. Julian retorted that it wasn't about ability, It was about loyalty. His body and soul belonged to Thomas. The mention of Thomas, all 17 or 18 of his replacements, made Asher laugh. The sounds from their room had been loud enough for the entire household staff to hear, though they were muffled enough to obscure who was in charge. As Asher dressed, Julian, not wanting to concede defeat by staying in bed longer, gritted his teeth and got ready as well, insisting they leave the room together. Asher waited, then opened the door to face the probing gazes of the maids. One of them, unsure of how to address him, settled on Mr. Drake and informed him that Mrs. Vance had said he could rest if he wasn't feeling well. Asher smiled brightly, assuring them he felt perfectly fine, and let their eyes drift over him. The maids looked horrified, their collective gaze shifting to Julian, who emerged behind him. One asked if Mr. Vance was all right. Julian, his face grim, echoed that he was fine too. An awkward silence fell. The staff, quickly grasping the situation, placed soft cushions on every chair at the breakfast table. Asher sat on his, staring into his bowl of oatmeal and steel-cut fruit, and contemplated the depths of Julian's self-destructive pride. Later, he watched Julian standing in the garden, listening to Eleanor, his face pale and beaded with sweat. Asher felt a brief urge to suggest he go lie down, but the moment he took a step forward, Julian's venomous glare stopped him. Just then, a cheerful voice called out "Cousin," and a small figure sprinted towards them. Julian turned, instinctively opening his arms. The figure, a delicate-looking Omega, launched himself into the air in a dramatic, petal-strewn leap, aiming for Julian's embrace. A direct hit would have surely done Julian some serious damage. Asher reacted instantly, stepping between them and extending a hand for a firm, friendly handshake. The newcomer, a fair-skinned Omega named Leo with wide, expressive eyes, stopped short. He ignored the outstretched hand and looked at Asher with theatrical surprise, asking who he was. Asher introduced himself. Leo's expression turned knowingly innocent. He remarked that Asher must be the alpha his cousin married to have babies. Julian's sharp reprimand of Leo did nothing to deny the statement. Smug, Leo shot Asher a triumphant glare. Asher withdrew his hand, and Leo scurried to Julian, wrapping his arms around his neck. The 100+ pounds of dead weight made Julian's face pale, but he had to play along, spinning Leo around before setting him down, his legs trembling slightly. Leo immediately clung to Julian's arm, whining about how Julian had promised to stay single forever in memory of Thomas. Eleanor's face hardened. She warned Leo that his behavior was getting out of hand and that if he didn't stop speaking so thoughtlessly to Julian's husband, he'd be sent back to France. Leo pouted, cuddling closer to Julian, who looked down at him with a doting expression. The three of them formed a cozy picture, leaving Asher feeling like an outsider. Leo shot him another look over his shoulder, a look of pure victory. Another drama queen. Perfect. Another 20 million on the horizon. While Eleanor showed Leo to his room, Asher cornered Julian in a bathroom. He knew Julian was in no shape to be walking around, no matter how much he postured. Though Asher had intentionally made the night memorable, he didn't want him in actual medical distress. Julian tried to shove him away, but Asher pinned him against the wall, his forearm pressing against Julian's back. Julian's face went white as he demanded to know what Asher was doing. Asher blew a warm breath against his ear, murmuring for him to guess. He felt the muscles in Julian's back tense as his fingers deftly and quickly administered a pain-relieving suppository. Julian swore violently. Asher covered his mouth, reminding him that his grandmother and cousin were still nearby. Julian froze. Asher worked the small suppository in, feeling Julian's thigh tremble and seeing the veins pop on his forehead. Just as Julian was about to explode, Asher withdrew his fingers. Julian straightened his clothes and stormed out, slamming the door so hard it nearly hit Asher's nose. Asher rarely resorted to such coercive tactics, but he had to admit, seeing Julian incandescent with rage was deeply satisfying. He followed Julian out at a leisurely pace, just in time to hear Leo demanding the master suite. Eleanor tried to intervene, explaining it was Julian and Asher's room, but Leo was insistent, claiming his weak lungs needed the superior light and ventilation. Julian's face turned black. Whatever promises he had made to his cousin, they clearly didn't extend to giving up the bed where certain unmentionable things had just occurred. He refused. Leo's face fell, his eyes filling with tears as he invoked Thomas's name, saying Thomas would never have let Julian treat him so cruelly. The appeal to his lost love clearly moved Julian, but he held firm. Asher stepped in, suggesting the bed was quite large. Both Julian and Leo looked at him, startled. He added that it could sleep 3. He smiled at Leo, letting a hint of his agave pheromone scent the air, and offered that he and Julian could both take care of him. Leo stuttered for a moment, mesmerized. Eleanor burst out laughing, pulling Leo away and declaring that she would look after him herself. Once they were gone, Julian turned to Asher, his expression disdainful. He told Asher not to think he could win his favor with such tactics. Asher just blinked, feigning confusion. Julian scoffed and brushed past him, muttering that no matter how much Asher tried, he would never be Thomas. In the days that followed, Leo mounted a campaign of petty torments, all designed to highlight Asher's status as an intruder. He cooked Thomas's favorite meals, reminisced with Julian about their shared past with Thomas, and staged dramatic nightmares where he would cry out Thomas's name until Julian came to comfort him. Julian, already a lost cause, fell for it completely, his gaze toward Asher shifting from mere disdain to outright resentment. Asher mostly watched the pathetic display with amusement. One day he found Leo crying on the stairwell landing, with Julian holding him, his face a mask of pain. Leo was sobbing that Julian had promised to be faithful to Thomas's memory. Julian sighed, trying to soothe him, and confessed the truth. The Vance Corporation was in dire straits. Years of bad investments had left them on the verge of collapse, the capital chain nearly broken. He had to get his hands on Eleanor's money to keep the company afloat. Asher had heard enough. He tapped on the railing, giving them a moment to separate before continuing down the stairs. Eleanor, eager to see her plan bear fruit, insisted on parading Julian and Asher around at social functions. At a charity ball, the music began, and neither alpha would yield to the submissive role in the waltz. Their dance turned into a clumsy battle, ending with them tripping over each other and landing in an accidental, cliched kiss in front of everyone. Leo flew into a rage, screaming at Julian for forgetting their past and fleeing the ballroom. Asher found him by the pool. Leo delivered another classic line, snarling that Asher should wait and see who Julian would save. The moment Julian came into view, Leo grabbed Asher and pulled them both into the water. As he flailed and screamed for help, Julian rushed to the edge, slipped on the wet marble, and went down in a painful-looking split, clutching his leg. Meanwhile, Asher calmly swam over to the sputtering Leo and pulled him to safety. It was a moonlit night. Leo, gasping for air, opened his eyes to see Asher leaning over him, water dripping from his hair onto Leo's face, his body a sculpture of honed muscle in the pale light. Leo's breath hitched, and he started to bleed from his nose. His fingers trembled as they reached up to touch Asher's lips. Asher chuckled softly, asking if he'd taken a liking to him. Julian's enraged roar shattered the moment. He hobbled over, demanding to know what Leo was doing. Leo scrambled back, his face pale with guilt. Julian, furious, turned and limped back toward the ballroom, leaving them both behind. Leo chased after him, pleading his innocence. By the time Asher, dripping wet, followed them, Leo was making a grand declaration in front of Eleanor and several other guests. He clutched Julian's arm, proclaiming that he wasn't interested in Asher. He had always been in love with Julian. Julian's head snapped up, and his eyes met Asher's. His lips began to tremble. Oh, this was good. Asher leaned against the doorframe, hands in his pockets, and smiled. He asked Julian if he preferred cash or a wire transfer. Julian, likely short on funds, immediately rejected Leo. He told him he was his cousin, and Thomas had seen him as a brother too. Leo, desperate, clung to him, saying he didn't want to replace Thomas. He just wanted to remember him together with Julian. In a moment of pure slapstick, Julian stumbled backward, and Leo, still attached to him, fell forward, their lips meeting in a clumsy, shocking kiss. The guests gasped. Eleanor's face went ashen, and she fainted. At the hospital, Eleanor, shaken but stable, held Asher's hand and apologized for the family's embarrassing behavior. Asher, feeling a strange, dry heat in his chest, perhaps from the cold water, simply smiled and said it was no trouble. There was compensation, after all. Eleanor ordered Julian to send Leo back to France within 2 days and to pay Asher $40 million. Julian was aghast. He protested that it wasn't his fault, but Eleanor cut him off, blaming him for giving Leo false hope. Leo, unwilling to give up, demanded to know why Eleanor was so insistent on the marriage. Eleanor, close to tears, finally revealed a long-held family secret. 60 years ago, the Vance family had faced a crisis that nearly destroyed them. It was Asher's grandfather who had saved them, using his connections and half his fortune to bail them out. Eleanor had always wanted to unite their families through marriage, but each generation had only produced alphas. Now, with her time running out, it was her last wish. She told Julian he was free to pursue what he wanted, but if he did, she would donate the entire inheritance to charity. Leo begged Julian to forget the money and honor Thomas's memory with him. Julian, kneeling by his grandmother's bed, was torn. Leo pleaded, but Julian finally looked at him and said he had to go, that he couldn't see him anymore. $100 billion was a powerful motivator. Outside the hospital room, Julian told Asher coldly not to assume everything would go his way. Asher just nodded. As Leo tried to argue with Julian one last time, Julian, furious at the trouble he'd caused, shook him off and strode away. Seeing Julian's resolve, Leo finally broke down in tears. Asher stepped up behind him and offered a handkerchief. Leo, remembering the pool incident, slapped it away, spitting that Asher hadn't won. He declared that Julian and Thomas had been together for 4 years, and no one could ever replace Thomas in Julian's heart. The heat in Asher's chest intensified, a swarm of angry ants crawling over his heart. He laughed softly. He asked Leo why, then, they had never married. Julian was 27. Age wasn't an issue, and his parents were gone. There were no obstacles. He pointed out that in 4 years they could have had a child old enough for preschool. If Julian loved him so much, why didn't they marry? Leo fell silent, his hands clenching and unclenching as if wrestling with a memory. The moonlight from the hospital corridor window cast long, distorted shadows on the floor. Asher told Leo he already knew the answer. Julian may have loved Thomas, but he never thought Thomas was good enough for him. He looked down on him. And Leo, by extension, looked down on him too, which was why he so casually used Thomas's memory as a weapon. Leo's jaw tightened. Asher pressed his advantage, pointing out that if the white moonlight himself wasn't worthy, what chance did a mere reflection like Leo have? Eleanor kept Leo at the hospital. When Asher returned to the penthouse, Julian was sitting in the dark, surrounded by empty liquor bottles. Asher suspected he was trying to drink his way out of paying the $40 million. He sat down next to him and simply said, "Pay me." Julian fumbled with his phone, typed furiously, then threw it at Asher. The screen showed an insufficient funds error, so he was trying to welsh on the deal. Asher grabbed Julian's ankle. Julian, limp with alcohol, didn't resist. He opened his eyes, his gaze hazy and unfocused. The dryness in Asher's chest became an inferno. For a fleeting moment, he wanted to lick the tears from Julian's long lashes. Julian closed his eyes again, sinking into the sofa cushions. Asher asked if he was drunk. Julian just snorted. "Fine. Not drunk." Asher leaned back, the leather groaning under his weight. Julian, his arm over his eyes, began to speak, his voice slurring. He talked about their ridiculous marriage, about how he should have married Thomas. He reminisced about their 4 years together in London, living in a tiny flat with no air conditioning, huddling together for warmth in the winter. He spoke of Thomas working multiple jobs to buy him birthday presents while happily accepting paper roses in return. He confessed that Thomas hadn't known his true identity, believing him to be just another struggling student. Julian's voice trailed off, his hand falling limp from the sofa. The moonlight caught his wrist, pale and fragile. Asher found himself taking Julian's hand, lifting it to his face. The scent of liquor, cold spring water, and Julian's pheromones hit him, and the heat he'd been suppressing erupted. His eyes burned red, the glands in his neck pulsing. He asked Julian, his voice a low whisper, if he remembered Thomas's full name. After a silence so long it felt like time had stopped, a single dreamlike whisper filled the room. Thomas Drake. Thomas Drake was his brother. Julian booked Leo a flight back to France. Leo threw a tantrum, but Julian stood firm. Finally, Leo relented, on the condition that Julian personally escort him to the airport. Wary of the 40 million he still owed, Julian insisted Asher come along. They sat in the back of a black town car, Julian and Asher on either side of a sullen Leo. Leo complained about Asher's presence, clinging to Julian's arm. Julian gently removed his hand, stating that Asher was his husband and had every right to be there. The ride was tense until Asher noticed the scenery changing. The urban sprawl of New York was giving way to dense woods. This wasn't the way to JFK. He looked at Julian, who seemed just as confused. Before either could speak, the bodyguard in the front seat barked an order. 2 pistols were suddenly pointed at their heads. The car stopped in a clearing. They were bound with zip ties and led into a derelict warehouse. The men were after money, not personal revenge, so Asher remained compliant. Julian, however, tried to resist and earned 2 punches for his trouble. Asher advised him that bravado was useless against bullets. They were forced onto the roof. The driver made a call, demanding 300 million in cash from Eleanor Vance. Asher scoffed at the logistics of such a sum and was rewarded with a fist to his gut. The driver, after a brief argument on the phone, agreed to a new plan. He hung up, his eyes scanning between Asher and Leo with a lecherous glint. He cut Julian's ropes, explaining that Eleanor could only get 200 million on short notice, enough to release 2 of them. He then told Julian, with a malicious grin, to choose who he would take with him. The cliché was so blatant Asher couldn't even summon a laugh. He looked at Leo, who immediately dropped his gaze. The fool. Julian would never choose him over the key to a $100 billion inheritance. As expected, Julian hesitated, then began to speak Leo's name. That was Asher's cue. He surged forward, tackling the driver from behind and yelling for Julian to move. Julian snapped into action, grappling with the driver for his knife. As it clattered to the ground, Asher scooped it up and cut his own bonds. The second man, the bodyguard, raised his gun at Julian. Asher shouted "A" and threw himself in front of Julian just as the gun fired. The bullet tore through his arm. Leo screamed. Julian, stunned, caught Asher as he fell. "What are you doing?" Leo shrieked at the men. This was supposed to be an act. You can't actually shoot him. The 2 men exchanged a look. One of them told Leo that 200 million was a lot more tempting than the 200,000 Leo had promised them. The truth dawned on Julian, his face turning to stone as he stared at his cousin. Leo, terrified, could only weep. The blood loss made Asher's world tilt and fade. Julian, his face a mixture of horror and something else, something softer, tore a strip from his own shirt to make a tourniquet, letting Asher rest his head in his lap. Asher managed a weak joke, asking if Julian would miss him like he missed Thomas. A flicker of genuine panic crossed Julian's face before Asher passed out. He woke up in a hospital. The botched kidnapping was over, the hired guns presumably dealt with quietly and permanently. Leo stood by his bed, red-eyed, and spat that Asher's heroics were pathetic before turning to leave, pausing only to mutter that he was glad he was okay. Shortly after, Julian came in. He apologized, explaining that to protect Leo's reputation, the incident would be handled privately. He asked Asher not to press charges. Asher, the only one actually injured in the farce, just smiled weakly and said it was fine, as long as Julian was okay. The expression on Julian's face shifted through a spectrum of emotions: doubt, fear, gratitude, shock. He had been consistently outmaneuvered by Asher, but now he suddenly felt he understood. He thought he had the upper hand again. He believed Asher was in love with him. He took Asher's hand, his old arrogance returning. He told him that after they received the inheritance, they didn't have to get a divorce. During Asher's recovery at the Vance estate, Julian was surprisingly docile. Eleanor was pleased with their apparent reconciliation and released several $100 million in funds to stabilize Julian's company. Without the drama of his personal life, Julian was a surprisingly dedicated CEO. Asher would often see him late at night, poring over documents, his brow furrowed in concentration. When he noticed Asher watching, he would offer a small, genuine smile. He had paid Asher the $40 million and had even given him an expensive watch as a gift. He was attentive, checking on Asher's wound, his touch lingering with a newfound possessiveness. He was back in his element. The turning point came swiftly and naturally. Julian went into his rut. Asher, who had been sleeping in the master bedroom alone to recover, was woken in the middle of the night by the overwhelming scent of Cold Springs. Julian was leaning over him, his face flushed, his eyes glazed with instinct, his pheromones a tangible, aggressive force in the room. He pinned Asher's hands. He was going to mark him. Asher saw the plan clearly. Use the rut as an excuse, get him pregnant, apologize later. Perfect solution. But alphas couldn't mark other alphas. Now, driven by biology, Julian was the vulnerable one. Asher twisted, capturing Julian's mouth in a searing kiss while his hand slipped under the pillow. He pulled out a syringe and plunged it into Julian's neck. Julian collapsed, his breath coming in ragged pants, his eyes wide and red-rimmed. Asher looked into those eyes, saw the raw need, and finally unleashed the agave heat he had suppressed for days. He leaned in close to Julian's ear and whispered that, as it happened, he was in his rut too. For 3 days, they were like caged animals, their pheromones clashing in a war that seeped through the cracks of the bedroom door, keeping the entire household at bay. Food and water were left outside. On the 4th day, hunger finally drove Asher from the bed. He brought water to Julian, who slowly regained consciousness. His first instinct was to flee, but he stumbled, fell off the bed, and twisted his leg. When the family doctor was called, the whole staff understood what had happened. Julian was furious and disappeared for 2 weeks. When he returned, he was different. He sought Asher out, staying in the same room, his touches frequent, almost needy. He was pregnant. At the hospital, holding the positive report, he looked first dazed, then resigned. He murmured that he never thought this would happen, that this was how he would finally move on from Thomas's world. Asher held him, his gaze soft as he looked at the pale nape of Julian's neck. He leaned in and kissed the tip of his ear. He wondered if Julian had really moved on, because Asher had no intention of letting him. Asher's father was thrilled and lifted the sanctions. His agent and assistant returned, bearing gifts for the baby. Julian was initially stunned by the gesture, but accepted the presents with a genuine, small smile. That night, as Asher held him, soothing him with his scent, he reflected on the power of hormones. Julian was becoming dependent on him, physically and emotionally. Perhaps love was blooming too, love for the father of his child, for the key to $100 billion fortune, for the man who was, in his own twisted way, showing him affection. When Julian was 4 months along, Asher had to leave for Vancouver to shoot a film. Julian protested, anxious about Asher's reputation and his own vulnerability during the pregnancy. Asher swore fidelity. To reassure him, he showed him the cast list. The lead Omega was Caleb, Julian's childhood best friend. Julian seemed relieved, and yet, somehow more worried. At the airport in Vancouver, the reunion between Julian and Caleb was a spectacle. Caleb, a striking blue-eyed Omega, stared at Julian's swollen belly, then wrapped an arm around his waist as if measuring him. Julian allowed it. He and Caleb bantered like old times, their easy intimacy on full display. Julian then took Caleb's hand and earnestly asked him to be his spy on set, to keep an eye on Asher and fend off any admirers. He wanted Caleb to be the only Omega near Asher during the shoot. Caleb hesitated, but Asher, ever the professional, enthusiastically agreed, praising Caleb's acting prowess. Julian, satisfied, promised Caleb he could be the baby's godfather before flying back to New York. While Julian was back in the city, enduring hormone shots and constant medical supervision, Asher played his part in Vancouver. He received photos from Julian's doctor showing his swollen ankles, along with messages about his sleepless nights and desperate need for Asher's calming pheromones. Asher would turn off his phone and continue with the charade. At a cast party, Caleb, drunk and territorial, intercepted drinks meant for Asher, declaring him off-limits. He plopped himself into Asher's lap, draping an arm around him possessively. Asher, seeing a phone camera flash in the corner of his eye, leaned in, resting his chin near Caleb's neck. The next day, Asher took a flight back to New York, arranging for a surprise visit. Julian wasn't in the bedroom. Asher found him in the walk-in closet, asleep in a nest he had built from Asher's clothes. An alpha, nesting. The sight of Julian, looking so fragile and thin despite his 6-month belly, curled up amidst his scent, sent a pang through Asher's chest, a bizarre mix of satisfaction and malice. He woke him gently. Julian, thinking it was a dream, didn't react until Asher lifted him into his arms. Finally realizing it was real, he wrapped his arms around Asher's neck, burying his face in his shoulder, inhaling deeply. And then he smelled it. The faint, fruity scent of Caleb's pheromones clinging to Asher's skin. He pulled back, his face paling. Asher played innocent, explaining that Caleb had been fending off advances for him at the party. He teased Julian, asking if he was jealous. A deep blush spread across Julian's face. Caught in his nest of clothes, any denial was useless. Asher kissed him, whispering that his body belonged only to Julian, and invited him to check. The next morning, Julian kicked him out of bed, shoving a phone in his face. A tabloid headline screamed about a showman's turned real, accompanied by the picture from the party. Asher feigned a yawn, explaining it was a misunderstanding. But Julian was fixated on one detail, Caleb sitting in Asher's lap. He accused Asher of cheating. Asher turned the tables, his voice going cold for the first time in their marriage. He expressed his disappointment that Julian would suspect not only him but also his own childhood friend whom he had personally asked for help. Julian faltered. The use of Caleb's first name, Caleb, instead of a more formal address, became a new point of contention. Asher, feigning exhaustion, lamented that he had flown across the country to see him, not to be interrogated. The guilt worked. Julian's anger dissolved into insecurity. He clung to Asher, apologizing, admitting he felt scared and unlike himself. Asher soothed him with his pheromones, stroking his neck, promising to keep his distance from Caleb outside of work. Julian shook his head, blaming his own hormones. Before returning to set, Asher made Julian breakfast, kissed his forehead, and promised to be back soon. Julian, desperate and clinging, made him promise to come home on time. The cycle repeated. Asher would return, shower Julian with affection, then grow impatient with his questions. Julian's emotions swung wildly. He depended on Asher, yet grew more paranoid with each passing day. He begged Asher to quit the film. Asher refused. He saw a news report about an on-set accident and bought a protective charm for Asher. Then, Caleb had a real accident, falling from a horse, and the charm ended up on Caleb's wrist in the hospital photos. That was the final straw. Julian flew to Vancouver. He found them in Caleb's hospital room. Worse, he found his own scent on Caleb. Asher had given him a temporary mark. Caleb tried to explain that he had gone into a sudden heat on set and the temporary mark was an emergency measure done in front of the entire crew. Julian didn't listen. He punched Caleb. The two childhood friends, an alpha and an omega, were now fighting over another man. Caleb, enraged and hurt, screamed at Julian for hitting him, shouting that Julian had never even hit him over Thomas. Asher pulled Julian into his arms, trying to calm him. But Julian was inconsolable. He held up his phone and played a recording. It was Asher and Caleb talking. Caleb suggested they help each other out, since their pheromones were compatible and Julian was too far along in his pregnancy for strenuous activity. Asher's laugh was audible on the tape. No clear agreement, but no rejection either. Everyone froze. Asher pushed Julian away, his face contorted in anger. "You bugged me?" Julian admitted it, and Asher's eyes fell to the watch Julian always insisted he wear. With a roar of fury, he tore it off and smashed it against the floor. Caleb, seizing the moment, screamed at Julian, revealing their childhood engagement pact and accusing him of repeating the same destructive patterns that had led to Thomas's ruin. He shrieked that everything Julian was suffering now was exactly what he had put Thomas through. The color drained from Julian's face. He turned to Asher, his hands shaking, reaching out. Asher slapped his hand away. His voice was tired, devoid of emotion. "I never thought you were this kind of person, Julian. You've disappointed me." It was the final line in his script. Julian staggered back as if struck, collapsing into a chair. Asher added the epilogue. "Let's get a divorce after the inheritance comes through. I'll pay you child support." Julian began to hyperventilate, clutching his chest. He didn't make a sound, but tears streamed down his face, his body shaking uncontrollably. Then a scream. Blood was pooling on the floor beneath his chair. He had collapsed. The memory, a mirror image of the past, jolted Asher. For a split second, he froze, then rushed forward, scooping Julian up and running towards the emergency room, screaming for a doctor. The baby was saved. Julian lay in the hospital bed, a pale ghost staring at the ceiling. Asher sat beside him, methodically peeling an apple, the skin spiraling down in one long, unbroken ribbon. "Still there?" Julian whispered. When Asher looked at him, confused, he clarified. "The baby. Without the baby, you wouldn't get the inheritance. We wouldn't divorce." The knife slipped, slicing Asher's thumb. He watched a bead of blood well up on his skin. "Do you love me?" he asked. Julian's eyes reddened. He stammered that it was a strange question to ask now. Asher cut him off. He told Julian his love was cheap, given for a hormone surge, a chance encounter, a passing resemblance, a single act of heroism. He was a man who loved easily and grandly, yet his love was always transactional, always tainted by self-interest. He was a faithless man who played the part of a heartbroken romantic. "If you had just been honest with Thomas," Asher said, plunging the knife into the peeled apple and holding it to Julian's lips, "he wouldn't have died." A lightning bolt of understanding struck Julian. The features of Asher's face sharpened into a familiar, terrible clarity. "Who is Thomas Drake to you?" he asked. Asher met his gaze. "My brother." Julian's face went blank. The story was a classic tragedy. A rich boy hides his identity to romance a poor boy. The love that blossoms in isolation withers when exposed to the real world. Julian had a world of options, and Thomas, who had gambled everything on him, began to lose his grip. After a bitter fight where Julian belittled him, telling him he should be grateful, Thomas discovered he was pregnant. It was meant to be a last chance, but it only hastened the end. He walked out. The next time Julian saw him, it was to identify his ashes. He had died from complications during a miscarriage. Julian had collapsed, spending months in a self-destructive spiral before starting his collection of replacements. He was an orphan, Julian whispered. He didn't have a brother. He was a bastard, Asher corrected. My father's. He sent a letter to our family before he died. I was the one who got it. No one else knows. Julian's eyes filled with a fresh wave of tears. Why didn't you bring him home? If he was a Drake, we could have. It would have worked out. Asher's expression was so scornful it silenced Julian. That's you, isn't it? It's never your fault. He explained that Julian's grand public grief was not for a lost love, but for a wound to his own ego. You did this on purpose, Julian said, his voice flat, dead. He was reliving the pain, and it was 1,000 times worse this time. This was revenge. Homomorphic revenge. Asher didn't speak. He watched the cold fire ignite in Julian's eyes. I won't let you win, Asher Drake. Julian left the hospital and waged war. Caleb was buried under an avalanche of scandals, his career ruined overnight. The film was thrown into chaos. But just as shooting wrapped a month later, news broke from New York. Eleanor Vance was on her deathbed. On the same day, Julian had the baby delivered by C-section at 36 weeks. Asher was barred from the hospital and from the Vance estate. Julian's lawyer delivered divorce papers. Asher refused to sign without speaking to Julian himself. He was escorted to Julian's office. Julian sat behind a massive desk, looking gaunt but dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, the picture of a ruthless CEO. Behind him was a bassinet. I'm surprised you went through with it, Asher said. 100 billion, Julian sneered. I wasn't about to give that up over you. He informed Asher that he'd had Eleanor change the will. He was now the sole heir. His expression was smug, triumphant. He had waited a month for this moment, to see Asher's plan crumble, to laugh at his meaningless revenge. He thought he had won. He didn't understand. It was never about justice. You really shouldn't have done that, Asher said softly, his tone almost gentle. He reminded Julian of their 70-30 agreement. Julian told him to get lost. Asher lunged across the desk and kissed him, hard, in front of the lawyer. He pulled back, a manic grin stretching his face. It's not over, he told him. He explained that Eleanor's $100 billion estate was actually $100 billion of debt. The liquid assets were a pittance. By inheriting everything, Julian had also inherited that debt. He reminded Julian of the old loan his grandfather had given the Vances, which had accrued a staggering amount of interest over 60 years. All of the Vance assets combined would only cover 70% of what was owed. By taking it all, Julian had bankrupted himself. Personal bankruptcy, however, wouldn't affect his spouse or child. Asher was still a beloved actor and a Drake. Julian was just a disgraced debtor. That, Asher said, is the end. The Vance empire crumbled. Julian sold everything he could, but it wasn't enough. Friends and allies vanished overnight. Asher bought the Vance estate and had Julian brought there. He had no choice. He was penniless, hounded by crores and trapped. He was now the caretaker of their child, surrounded by the staff Asher provided, a prisoner in his own home. He fought, he raged, but Asher had endless ways to enforce his spousal duties, methods eerily similar to those Julian himself had once used on Thomas. He finally broke. A perfect revenge, he said one evening, his voice hollow as he lay on the sofa. What's next? An accident? Cancer? Asher looked at him. Thomas isn't dead. Julian shot upright, his eyes wide with disbelief. The baby was gone. Asher continued, his voice flat. He faked his death to escape you. I sent him back to Europe. He's married to a professor now. I sent a wedding gift last month. Tears streamed down Julian's face. He covered his face and sobbed, a raw, guttural sound of grief and loss that went on for 20 minutes. When he could finally speak, his voice was a rasp. Can I see him? He said he never wants to see you again. After another bout of ragged sobs, he asked why Asher was telling him this now. I was the one who saw you playing the guitar in the square first, Asher said. The $100 and the flowers? I told him to give them to you. Julian's breath hitched. And this marriage? I proposed it to Eleanor. She agreed because she believed I could be your other half. You love me? The question was incredulous. I'm not sure, Asher said with a chilling smile. I'm a sociopath. I saw you at a party when I was 12. You were fighting over a chicken leg. You made an impression. A gasp of cold air. Julian understood. Asher's life was a performance. I do care for my brother, Asher conceded. So I was happy to help with his plan. In exchange, he signed away his rights to the Drake inheritance. My feelings for you, hate, love, they might just be an imitation of what I saw between you and him. But I can say this for certain, you make me feel things, good and bad. And that's interesting. Julian was speechless for a long moment. Finally, he whispered, you're a monster. And so are you. You're disgusting. Asher leaned in, his fingers twining with Julian's. I hope I can disgust you forever. He kissed him, and after a moment of resistance, Julian kissed him back.